Good evening. Welcome to all of you. My name's Simon Fanshawe. I was one of the original founders of Stonewall, one of the original 6, and I was also involved in the starting of Kaleidoscope. And now, professionally, I work on diversity and inclusion with organisations in lots of different sectors, in all 3 sectors. Many of you might be curious about the LGB Alliance. A couple of words about them to start with. It was set up by a group of lesbians and gay men and bisexuals, most of whom have spent their lives campaigning for equality for people who are gay, attracted to the same sex, lesbians, gay men and bisexuals, names on the tin. It's entirely funded by individual donations. So contrary to any kind of fake news of the Trumpian kind, you may have heard from people who frankly should know better, it receives no money or engagement whatsoever from right-wing or even left-wing subversive influencing foundations. It's rather born out of the concerns of many, many lesbians, gays and bisexuals who believe that the rights for which they campaigned for so long and so hard are now under threat because of concerted attempts to campaign for a wholesale confusion between biological sex and gender and a takeover by gender identity ideology. So what we're going to do today is discuss those concerns. What are they based on? What are gay men worried about with this increasing attempt to take over campaigning organisations? Why are they worried about the confusion between sex and gender, which affects equality laws, or the choices open to children and young people, or women's participation in sport and freedom of disagreement? You also might wonder why this is called the gay spot. Well, it's because of Ruth Ellis, the black lesbian pioneer who died on October 2000, aged 101, and her lifelong partner, Ceciline Babe Franklin. They moved to Detroit in 1937. At that time, black same-sex couples were simply not welcome at white gay bars, nor were they welcome at black straight clubs. So they made their home a place where the community could dance and sing and socialise. From the 1940s to the 1960s, their house became known as the gay spot. So welcome to all of you to Ruth and Babe's house. The evening will work in the usual way. I'll ask questions of our small but perfectly informed panel, and we'll discuss the issues for a while. Please do write questions in the Q&A whenever they occur to you. The lovely Dermot, who is hidden from you and dressed only in a pair of sequin Y-fronts in celebration, I understand, of Saint Phileas, whose saint's day it is today, and who I understand from Wikipedia refused to offer sacrifices to the gods and was beheaded by the local governor of Thumis in Egypt. Perhaps a fighter for free speech. So Dermot will pass them on to me, and I can ask the panel for their response in the second half, and the whole caboose will end somewhere shortly after 8 o'clock. I can promise you there will be no hate, no debating trans people's existence, because that is neither the issue nor the views held by panelists, nor by me. I can say without fear of contradiction that everyone on the panel will, as they have done for many years, continue to fight for the ability of trans people to live in freedom without harassment. The anxieties and disagreements are about self-ID and gender ideology. So to the panel, in alphabetical order by surname, because I'm posh and went to public school. Firstly, Malcolm Clark. He is a founding member of LGB Alliance, he's a TV documentary filmmaker, and as will become clear, is Scottish. Hello, Malcolm.
How are you doing?
Feels like celebrity squares. James Roberts is the creator of professional networking events for gay men in London, particularly The List and 28 Gays Later. His history is steeped in the gay community. He's a one-time project manager for a regional Pride Festival, and he's the former chair of trustees of the LGBT Consortium. Hello, James.
Hello.
And lastly, Lachlan Stuart, a self-described former policy wonk and Heelan lad. He was a senior policy advisor to Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader of the Labour Party. We were being joined by James Dreyfus, but unfortunately he's literally lost his voice and he can't speak, so our thoughts are with him. So look, chaps, first I thought I'd ask you, what turned you on to the potential damage of what's going on at the moment? I know for me that I was given a really tough and wonderful education politically in the late 70s, early 80s by a group of feminists who really kind of beat me up around class and around sex-based rights. And it's been a hugely important part of my life to understand the way in which many of the things women have had to fight for, you know, whether it's the vote or whether it's control over their bodies or whether it's not being chattels of the marriage or whether it's, you know, against in other cultures, FGM and so on and so forth. These things flow very literally from, you know, women's biological sense and existence as women. And that's been very important to me because it seems it's very important to preserve what flows out of that. So that was my kind of turning point. And I wondered if I'd asked you what first raised alarm bells for you, Lachlan?
Well, I've been interested in the whole area of sex and gender for many, many years. But more recently, and within this debate, I was studying policies for the Labour Party. That was my job. And I was looking at some of the flashpoint issues about women in prisons, about women's sports and so on, because those were in my area's responsibility, as was the NHS. I was looking at clinical protocols, and it was striking, the explosion in referrals to gender identity services. And in trying to explore that, I came across the voice of detransitioners, which were just not being heard at that time. And it shocked me. It said to me, some of these diagnoses are erroneous. They're getting it wrong. And that has deep and profound implications for lesbians and gay men and for gender non-conforming youth that need to be addressed. And it sort of became, from there, it became more than an analytical policy exercise to become something that I personally engaged with.
So Malcolm, what rang those bells?
I mean, everything Lachlan is saying, I think we've all honed in on as important. But I'm a documentary maker, and so my job for a long time has been taking, you know, a big subject, usually science or history, investigating it. I worked for BBC Horizon, so we would often in an hour take a huge medical scandal or science scandal or cover up, and we would dissect it. And then around about 10, 15 years ago, it became impossible to ask any critical questions about any of the main planks, if you like, of the transgender argument. So you weren't allowed to say, I'm not quite sure about this paper on puberty blockers. It doesn't convince me that puberty blockers reduces suicide. I mean, there's an interesting paper recently that showed that many of the arguments about surgery turn out not to be true either, that often people who go through surgery don't solve their gender dysphoria. And so I was just surprised by how you weren't allowed to ask questions. And then, of course, inevitably, once you're told you can't ask questions, you start to ask more questions. And this whole area of debate has been silenced. And I think it's not healthy for society. It's not healthy for trans people. It's not healthy for anybody. If you can't ask questions that are important, then we're in trouble.
Okay, so James, you've been, as I said, steeped, I think was the word, and immediately I had a sense of sloes being gently left in gin, but you've been steeped in the lesbian, gay, LGBT kind of world for a long time. Have you changed your view, or was there something that just suddenly made this apparent to you?
I think it's kind of, there's always been a tension I've been aware of why have we lumped gender identity and sexual orientation together. There's parallels in terms of, you know, one group's rights is everybody's rights and freedoms and supporting each other, but they're very distinct communities and different needs. And when I was at the LGBT consortium, we talked about LGB and T, and even within LGB there are different communities. So I've always kind of had that view of there are distinct differences here as well as our similarities. But increasingly in the last couple of years, seeing more of kind of what's being covered and talked about, reading on things about postmodernism, queer theory, gender ideology, and it kind of made me think about particularly young gay boys, and think about when I was kind of maybe a little bit effeminate child, and you know, are you playing with girls' toys or boys' toys? I I remember I was probably only 6 or 7 at some cousin's house. It had been her birthday recently. She was younger, and she had one of these scale model kitchen toys with the full sink and the oven and everything. And I was playing away with that, and it didn't strike me as odd at all. I had 2 little sisters, all play with the same toys. It wasn't until one of the other adults, not my parents, had said something along the lines of, "Are you a girl? Why are you playing with the girls' toys? You shouldn't be playing with that." Yeah. That's my earliest memory of that kind of notion. Sorry, go on.
So yeah, so I mean, what I think is interesting about these things is that they are, in a sense, they're policy things. They're anxieties, aren't they, about the direction of travel, and they're also anxieties about the fact that actually there are differences here, and it seems to me what lies at the root of diversity, what lies at the root of inclusion, is the recognition of difference and the need to speak about these things so we can find some way through them. But Malcolm, why does this matter to gay men? I mean, that's a general issue, and there's a lot of anxiety around about, for instance, freedom of speech or, you know, stereotyping, whatever. Why does it particularly matter to gay men, in your view?
Well, it's partly what James is saying, that, you know, a whole generation of young and up and coming gay men and lesbians at schools, you know, 12, 13, 14, 15, are now being told that they might be trans, and pushed gently towards puberty blockers and all the rest, and it's increasing that pressure. I mean, now we're being told that even to question a trans child about their reason for thinking they're trans is somehow transphobic, and it must be affirmed. First thing they say, when they say they're trans, that's it, it must be affirmed. I mean, I think, Simon, actually, at the launch of LGB Scotland, you made a really good point, which was, you know, when we were arguing for gay rights, you know, 20, 30 years ago, the worst thing that could happen to a child, you know, that's why the whole Section 28 comparison is so absurd, because the only thing that could have happened if a kid 30 years ago thought they were gay is they might experiment, they might, you know, go have sex or something and then think, oh, I'm not gay. That's the worst that could happen. But now a whole bunch of kids are getting sort of fast tracked into transgender ideology.
But there's a separation here, isn't there? And I mean, Lachlan made the point about the detransitioners as well. But there is a separation here between people who are going to gender identity clinics or whatever, and increasing numbers of those people who are actually being in some way diagnosed in that way. But isn't that different from a sort of more general sense that actually, instead of people coming to terms with themselves, there's a sense in which they're being told there's something, again, there's something wrong with them. In other words, they're in the wrong body or whatever. And I mean, Lachlan, was that what worried you about the detransitioners? Was it the sharp end, if you like, the diagnosis, the medical, the surgical, that drive? Or was it that was then, in a sense, spreading backwards into the more general arguments about how people were framing their anxieties in puberty and so
on? Yeah, it was in some extent both of those. I had a very legalistic regulatory approach to the issue, if you like, and I think law is one of the issues as why this matters to lesbians and gay men. Law needs to be precise, we need to understand, but linked to that was the language that was being used. So it's law and language, but it's also it matters to us because of what is the nature of conformity. Most of us are, well, we are gender non-conforming by virtue of being gay. But I think also that it's the tenor of the debate that matters in many ways to gay men, because it's very censorious, you know, this whole cancel culture stuff. And ultimately, it's always the weak or the oppressed who lose out in a debate like that. This will backfire, but we are giving permission to say these views, these discussions, that just raising these issues about detransitioners is not allowed. It's verboten. Well, that will backfire, and it will backfire on gay people. It will backfire on trans people. It backfires on women, and that's a very dangerous place to be.
I mean, to extend this idea a bit about language and policy, let's talk about that, because it does seem to me that there's a confusion in the discussion between kind of presentation and this whole idea of stereotypes and who you are and how you present socially. Then there's a whole set of issues about law. And I mean, let's set aside biology in a sense, because I don't know about you, but I mean, I haven't read anything that's credible that says that there aren't more than two sexes. You know, that's one issue. Let's not debate that tonight, because a lot of this flows from that. So there's a difference between social presentation and policy. So when, as a policy wonk, Lachlan,
yeah.
What's the problem with self-ID, for instance? Because on one level, why not allow people to declare and then they can live as they want?
I mean, in a way, you're asking that question to the wrong person, because I'm a supporter of self-identification. I think it's and I've had this argument lots of times with lots of people on our side. I do think it's politically untenable now, right at this moment, but I don't think it was 3 years ago. Article 8 right to privacy means you have to respect someone's personal identity. And if someone tells me they've got a gender identity, that has to be respected. The problem arises when that conflicts with other rights. None of these human rights are absolute. The only human right that's absolute is the right to freedom for torture. And so if your self-identity requires an imposition on somebody else in some way, and the issue I was discussing today on Twitter was cervical smear tests, because it's a very upfront one. But there are loads of issues like that. Then that's what we call a conflict of rights. Both rights are real, in my view, but you have to calibrate where they come into conflict. And there are all sorts of ways of measuring that. But it's very clear that this does give rise to some conflict of rights, and that rights not being absolute, there need to be some curtailment of when one overrides another.
Malcolm,
that's the legalistic issue.
I think there's practical.
I would take a different view on self-ID, I think, because I don't think it's a
but
good
lots of
legal
people
tool.
do.
Malcolm, do you take a different view on sort of the legal tool of self-ID?
Well, it's the practice. I think what happened was self-ID, in theory, sounds like a great idea. I mean, great freedom. We'll all, embrace it. But there are really practical, sensible things that people just didn't plan when they wrote the theory, which is that the effect on society, once you trigger self-ID and effectively you say anybody can say they're a woman, we're often, calumniated as being paranoid about trans women walking into a girls' changing room. I mean, I think generally our side isn't that concerned about trans women walking into girls' changing room. Obviously, there are problems there, but that's not the main problem. The problem is that once you say that anybody can be a woman, and Alex Drummond, the famous trans activist with the beard who had no surgery or anything else, is now able to enter women's spaces, then how do you stop non-trans people who look, i.e. blokes, who look like Alex Drummond with a beard? How do you stop them going in? What you've done is you've dissolved all the normal boundaries, the usual boundaries that stopped men, heterosexual men, going into women's spaces. You've said everything's a free-for-all. But if a guy who looks like Alex Drummond walks into a women's space and you think, oh, she must be a trans woman, how do you know the other guy who walks in there isn't a trans woman? And that's a practical problem that I have never heard any trans activists solve that problem, and they refuse to debate. And it's stupid because it's a practical problem which, if everyone got together, we could solve that in some way.
Well, it's one of the interesting questions about the notion of rights, isn't it? As Lachlan pointed out, that actually we have this notion that rights are absolute, but the truth of it is that actually what they're designed to do is enable us to get on together. And so in a way, the product has to be getting on together. So James, when you were in that phase, and I know it was a decade ago, so the arguments weren't as hot as they are now, but you said LGBT anti, that seemed to be explicitly understanding that at that point, those two groups of people had different demands of the legislature, they had different demands of society, and so on and so forth. At that point, how did you, in a sense, was there a tension that you needed to resolve, or could you simply carry on those ways, and there was a recognition that it was kind of parallel path?
I mean, this was just prior to Stonewall adding the T. I know there's obviously a big debate there, so it kind of was assumed in the kind of pre-debate for that as to whether trans issues sits with LGBT and same-sex orientation issues. I think that the difference then to now, aside from the explosion of social media and how easy it is for people to say something from behind a screen that they wouldn't say in person. But I have an example of kind of a late middle-aged trans woman at a conference for LGBT Consortium coming up and talking to me during the break about just wanting to get on with her life as a woman and not having to always be labeled trans. She's done the transition bit, that's how she lives now. And it was just, I want to get on with my life. Whereas the debate now, with the kind of the language games of postmodernism and queer theory and breaking down the blurring of the boundaries, is you can be anything. You can literally be a female just because you say you are. And well, you can't. Like you say, there are two biological sexes. Don't drag intersex people into it. That's not proof there's a third sex. So I think that the difference now is it's not just a tension between the different needs of different communities. It's that the trans rights lobby, which I don't think actually represents most trans people, is almost the virtue signaling wokeness of you have to agree with this 100% or you hate us all.
There's an interesting, YouGov did a kind of state of the nation poll last year about the state of trans rights in Britain. And one of the things that was very noticeable was that the general public, and in other words, most people, perceive this, and partly because this is what the legislation was designed to help with, they perceive this as being about a process of transition, albeit you started it, but actually there's a sense of transition. And it strikes me from what you've just said and experiences, is that part of the problem, Malcolm, is that this trans umbrella, stemming from what James was talking about, this kind of absolute subjectivity about notions of identity, it's actually that's causing the problem. And there's an awful lot of people who are in the process of transition who kind of are beginning to resent the expansion of this umbrella. Is that your sense?
Well, I mean, the term true scum, which was invented by some of the wilder trans activists.
What does this mean? I'm not familiar.
It's a term that refers to what we would all think of as good old-fashioned transsexuals who've gone through the whole process. And of course, a lot of transsexuals support us. And the term was a sort of social media invention, a derogatory term to describe these old-fashioned trans people who bothered to go through the whole transition. The problem, of course, is the public think that's what trans people are, the people who really care so much that to try to be the other sex that they will go through a massive change, and we all respect that and admire it. But that's not what the bulk of the trans umbrella includes now. I mean, I've lost count of the number of the various terms, the neutroids, the agender, the demi-romantic. I mean, that's not what the public thinks the debate is about. They think it's about that small minority of people who have gone through hell to try to achieve the sex that they want to be. And that's where all the confusion has happened. And
I mean, Lachlan, isn't that Isn't that the problem with self-ID, is that there's a question of self-ID in terms of self-actualization, who I am in the world. I'm going to behave in this way, I'm going to dress in this way, and so on and so forth, even to the extent of saying, I'd like you to call me X, Y, or Z. But there's a difference, isn't there, between that and a legal tool which enables this transition and all that goes with it. So if you think of, women's sport as an example, there is some need, isn't there, as you say, to resolve a clash of rights, which potentially in that case could end up in very serious injury or even death, might we say. So, I mean, doesn't self-ID don't we have to be careful about what we mean by self-ID and what we mean by some sense of social presentation or realizing yourself in social terms?
I think that there are a whole load of different options and different models. You can be very free on self-ID if the safeguards are strong and firm about it, so and I think we haven't got the balance quite right in the law as is, and we certainly wouldn't get the balance right if we were adopting some of the proposed changes. So it's about balancing rights, and you can move something at one end and something at the other, and sport's a very, very good example, but it's one of the exemptions that where discrimination would be lawful. That's the mechanism that the law has currently decided. is the appropriate balance. There are other options. That's not the only one. So I genuinely think you can be quite free on identity, because we've all got a personal identity. But if you are, then you need some fairly firm calibrations where that gives rise to conflict.
Okay. Now, James, you shared playing with the sister's cooker, and actually, which is funny when you think of the number of male chefs that are around these days. I wonder if the reaction would be the same. But apart from that, what was the campus thing? In one sense, what was the campus thing you did under the age of 20?
Campus probably fairly bored. I'm just thinking about kind of...
Well, gender non-conforming, if you prefer.
I suppose so the after-school sports clubs at primary school, most of the boys did football. There was a few that didn't. I was the only boy that did netball.
You're practically a lesbian, in other words.
Yes.
What about you, Malcolm? Because you're very butch, so you must have had quite a stretch there.
I mean, I grew up in a really, really rough working class community in Ayrshire, where I was bullied the shit out of. So I always think it's so funny when I was disputing, whether or not LGBT groups should be in schools, and I was getting harassed on Twitter saying, you want kids to be bullied. I think that is so ridiculous, because I know exactly what it was like to be bullied.
Okay. But the campus thing you did?
Well, that's the thing. I don't think I was very careful, I think, not to be camp. But then, of course, when I went to university, I went nuts, and so that was fantastic. So, but I do remember my friend George and I at university. We dressed up as campus Christmas, glitter everywhere, makeup, and we went to the Queen Margaret Union for a dance, and then we thought, oh, it'd be a laugh. We'll go into the women's toilets, and two big butch lesbians threw us out, and I always think, we were 19. And we had no idea about the issues. And so I get why a lot of these kids, 18, 19, they don't get it either. They need a big butch lesbian to kick them out of the toilet and explain why.
And Lachlan, you're very grown up, but give us a glimpse into, under 20.
Well, when I was a little young, I haven't always been sensible. I went to live in Moscow immediately after the dissolution of the USSR. And I spent about 10 years working out there. There was no underground gay scene, but there were no clubs, there were no bars, there was no Spartacus guide or anything. But I wanted to get in touch with the underground gay scene. And so I went to the Bolshoi Ballet, which I thought was quite a good bet.
Good start. And
I dressed up and took my brolly and did this sort of twirl routine on the steps to try and attract attention of ballet dancers. And nobody knew me. It was very freeing living in Moscow in those days, not like it is today. And I was successful. I met a lovely ballet dancer called Sasha, who later took me to the first gay club that opened in Moscow, where we started doing all sorts of work. And I got introduced to lots of Russian gays.
Now, would it work?
Sorry?
Would it work if we tried it now?
You know, I have no idea. I suspect it'd be quite dangerous. Well, not in Moscow, but in some parts of Russia, it'd be quite dangerous to be so openly camp. Certainly, I was a lot camper then than I was now. I learned not to be, actually.
So certainly mine was not in public. Mine was that up until the age of about 8, in my head, I moved house a lot. So we always lived. And I went to boarding school, of course, because I'm dead posh. And so I never knew anybody where my parents lived. I never had any friends at their home because all my friends were at school. And so I spent a lot of time on my own, a little bicycle and whatever. And I used to have this sort of fantasy life, and it won't come as any surprise that at quite a young age, I decided in my head that I was a female barrister. And I had this very glamorous husband, and we had 2 children, and I even picked a house out of country life for us to live in. But it did. Therapists have obviously spent a lot of time and money on unpicking that one. But look, the reason I'm asking this, obviously, is because the concerns that are emerging are because there's a danger that what's happening to young people is that their non-conforming behaviour is being misunderstood, and they're not being given a sense of a choice. That's one thing. Secondly, that in order to enable these different groups of people to live together, there has to be the conversation. And so this idea that there can't be a discussion or a debate is causing all of you and me to be very, very anxious about that. So let me ask you, have you managed to have conversations with people with whom you disagreed on this? And together, have you managed, if you like, to change their mind? Have they managed to change yours? Have you in some way, James, had a conversation that was productive? And if so, why do you think it was productive?
I guess I'm just starting to, with friends who I know are the kind of people who will put their pronouns in their Twitter bio, who aren't trans. I've started being a bit more open on LinkedIn. And in a kind of professional world, and having people comment on the things I've commented on, and kind of not necessarily people who've surprised me, but kind of it's been a welcome surprise how many people have kind of liked a comment or responded to a comment. That actually it shows me there are a lot more people out there who probably are questioning what they're kind of being fed and are supposed to go along with, particularly in the workplace, with the kind of rise of, you have to put your pronouns in your email. Like I've said, it's like putting your star sign in your email. You just wouldn't. It's meaningless. But it's that kind of, the tension, I think, is when you're in a situation where you are having to go along with that kind of thing, where you don't think that it feels right, and then the conversations that you are able to have or not able to have, because the conversation is shut down, you can't even ask that question to HR or to other colleagues for fear of being, dragged up in front of HR and being accused of transphobia.
Yes. Malcolm, have you had those conversations in a way that have turned productive?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that LGB Alliance is always saying we want to have a debate with people. We never get the chance to debate. I think if half the people that we want to debate with just gave us 5 minutes, we wouldn't convince them, but they would see that there must be areas of common ground where we can find some compromise. But and I've had a lot of discussions lately with the kids of friends, kids who are like 18, 19, 20, 21, and of course they're all gender fluid, they're non-binary, or they're whatever. And it's interesting. I mean, they get it that, I get it that it's great, their lifestyle and the way that they explore, but certain things have begun to click with them. For example, that recent news night that showed, I've been saying to them that there are such things as homophobic parents who would like to have a straight daughter rather than a gay son. And they say that's ridiculous because, of course, they're so woke and they're so liberal that they can't believe these people exist, these homophobic parents. But then they watch the news night, and I've sent clips to them, and they are amazed, and they think, oh, no, I get it. I think it's because we all think homophobia has disappeared. And all that woke young generation think homophobia doesn't exist, but it does. And it's just found a new form.
And there's one of the things that, I always call it the Kanye West issue, which is that some people say, I can't understand, why would Kanye West support Trump? Well, the answer is, it seems to me, twofold. One is Kanye West is a billionaire. He's not just black. And secondly, he's black. He's got agency, he's got a mind, and he's made a decision. And Stuart, there seems to, I called you Lachlan earlier on, I just realised, of course, Stuart,
that's
sorry.
Right. Lachlan's my first name, Simon.
It's a very Scottish thing to have sort of two apparently surname first names. Sorry about that, Stuart. There does seem to me something of which this is a reflection rather than a cause, which is the assumption that all these groups, that all lesbians and gays and LGBT people, all black people, in a sense, do everything as one. And that actually what we need to understand, don't we, is that as liberation or progress happens and you get a bit more liberation and so on and so on, actually what that produces is a diversity of lifestyles, opinions, views, and needs and wants and aspirations. So is it, what I'm really asking is, do you see this as part of, Lachlan, do you see this as part of his this kind of enforced sense of kind of group identity, and actually we need to be freer than that?
I just find it so ironic that this is a demand for conformity of thought. There's no non-conformity permitted, and so I loathe the term LGBTQ plus whatever acronym you use community singular, because we're not a community, we are communities. We overlap, some of us have things in common, some of us really don't have anything in common, and not even anymore our sexual orientation, since we include lots of people who have no, so we're not a single community, and we don't think alike. And the idea that we have to, I mean, we do have solidarity, and we have long-standing alliances, and we have common interests in many, many respects. I mean, most of us are interested in the nature of sex and gender, one way or the other, but very often differently interested. So, yeah, I find the whole idea that we need to subscribe to groupthink, apart from anything else, I mean, it's stultifying. We will make no progress if we allow no dissent. We did not, we didn't make progress in the 80s by all agreeing. We hugely disagreed. The disagreements between Stonewall, between outrage, between grassroots, between establishment, and everyone played their part, and we fought with each other all the time, but everybody played an important part in those days. For me, the turning point was lesbians and gays support the minors. For me, that was the catalyst of the modern lesbian and gay movement. Older people would probably say it was Gay Liberation Front, but for me, with my Labour perspective, that was it. And we were, I mean, I was a really minor fringe player shaking a bucket. I'm not claiming any centrality to that whatsoever, but we were castigated by all sorts of people. Mark was a communist. He was the student.
Mark, who started it, yes.
Mark Ashton, yeah, Mark. He's a much missed, lovely chap. But I rowed with him because he was a communist, and
Well, so, I tell you, the David Donovan, the NUM representative who came to speak at a benefit we did in the Electric Ballroom in Camden to support lesbians and gays, support the minors, which if you've seen the film Pride, it's down in Pride as a music gig, and it wasn't, it was a comedy gig. Anyway, it's strange, but he made this wonderful speech and it inspired me beyond belief. He defined solidarity for me. He said, you wore our badge, and now we will wear yours. And what he didn't say was we'll both wear the same badge. It was that real understanding of commonality between difference. And don't you think part
Why do you say that, Simon? May I just make one point?
Yeah.
I think that's really important, because solidarity is my business. It's really important why gay men stand up for lesbians now. Yeah. They stood up for us.
They did, and when we started Stonewall, I mean, lesbians got involved. We were equal numbers on the Stonewall group, and the whole point was that the lesbians got the point, but it didn't involve them the age of consent at all. They weren't legislative involved. But what I think is interesting about this is there's a real difference, isn't there, between the group experience. We all experience bullying or homophobia, and we know what it's like on the street, what I call the fist in the face moments. When you're being discriminated against. But actually that doesn't describe everybody's individual experiences or aspirations. And that's we seem to have lost some content of. Now I've got questions, so people are bowling them in. Thank you very much. And Dermot is managing to squirm on his chair in his sequin underwear, and he's managed to feed me some here. So as a gay man in my 30s, I feel increasingly alienated by the sudden increase over the past few years of the word queer to describe us. I don't wish to be labelled with a word that was used to harm us, nor do I find it helpful to stick a whole host of different people under one big umbrella. Your reactions quickly, James, to the use of the word queer to describe, I don't quite know what.
That's it. I hate the use of the word queer. I think people are trying to reclaim it in the way other words have been potentially reclaimed. It's an abusive slur. I think it's for me indicative of particularly a younger woke generation and in the point with this webinar, gay men who are less affected by things than lesbians, but are still affected by this. There's a lack of understanding of our own history and what has happened before. And part of that is they've grown up in a world where they haven't had as much challenge as maybe some of us had, and they don't see how important this is. And little things like the kind of use of language and the kind of ignoring what has come before, the impact that has.
I certainly agree with you. I think it's the gay equivalent of the N-word, and you can't reclaim it. It just seems to me frightening and also meaningless. I don't know what queer means. It seems to be applied to everything as a sort of synonym for gay, when actually, and I did ask someone the other day, and it turned out there was somebody introduced me to a married couple, male and female, who call themselves queer, and I was like, yeah, but you're married and you live in a house together and you're monogamous. I don't get it. Malcolm, sorry?
It's to be other. It's a very woke, how many kind of oppression points can I earn by being in lots of different groups or categories? And if I'm other than the main,
I'm actually very boring, but I need to, if I give myself a word.
Let's try and be, sorry, I set the wrong tone.
I feel very strongly about it.
Let's be more positive about it.
I think that one of the pivot points in gay history was when Larry Kramer, great hero of the gay movement, who fought against AIDS, when he gave $1 million to support, to found a lesbian and gay history department in one of the American universities, he was outraged, so to speak. After 2 years, they renamed it Queer History. He took away the rest of the money. He declaimed loudly that he was furious because he hated the word queer, and I think it's just a ridiculous word.
Okay, thank you for this webinar. I'm a proud Black lesbian and have spent my whole life fighting for the rights of LGB and T. I'm now finding that the community, in quotes, accuse me of being a bigot and transphobic simply because I do not date people with penises. Many of my gay male friends are also finding they're no longer able to be same-sex attracted. Would you agree that homophobia is now as bad, if not worse, than it was in the 90s? Only this time the homophobia is coming from our own community. I mean, Lachlan, that's a really heartfelt cry from somebody whose first sentence would expect you not to have had that experience.
Yeah, indeed. I think this is an issue that disproportionately affects the nature of the relationships between men and women. Means that this is an issue that disproportionately affects lesbians, because if trans men wanted to, you know, somehow coerce gay men into the boxer short ceiling, it's not nearly as threatening as when someone does it to a lesbian. So I think that's less of an issue. On the question is homophobia worse now? I don't think it is. I think it's worse than it was 5 years ago, or even 3 years ago. I don't think it's worse than it was 20 years ago in the or even 40 years ago. We had calls for quarantine and for all sorts of restricted rights, and I don't think we're there yet. But I do think it's worsening, and I think the opinion polls show that. Social attitude surveys show that, and I think that that's something to seriously worry about. Our rights and our social acceptance are fragile, and they're being thrown away. And you know, I will fight that on behalf of, whether you like it or not, on behalf of all lesbians and gay men.
I think the boxer ceiling thing, it's not the same issue, in that there's not an immediate threat in the way a male-bodied person coercing a lesbian to believe that they are also a lesbian. But I think there is an erasure of gay men. I've been called, I'm not a homosexual, I'm a homogenital. I have a genital preference. Again, it's the blurring of boundaries. If sex is not going to exist because we're all a gender, same-sex attraction doesn't exist. And I think it's more subversive than, it's a different type of threat than the physical threat of a male-bodied person claiming to be a lesbian. But I think it's as insidious and dangerous a threat.
Malcolm, do you go on Twitter and you take it on, but I assume you get quite, in fact I know you get attacked, but in quite overt and particular terms.
It's interesting. I agree with Lachlan. I don't think the homophobia is this as bad as, I mean, we all remember when you had to be quite careful when you walk down the street. I can't remember the last time I worried about when I was walking down the street or anybody being homophobically violent or anything. But it's a different kind of homophobia, and it's one, as James says, it actually, I mean, homophobes in the past didn't deny we existed. They wanted to beat the shit out of us. It's a new kind of woke homophobia that says we don't actually exist. So in that film last year that celebrated the 50th anniversary of in the middle, they had a little bit of trans pride, which is fine. But then there's that, I often tweet the piece from this trans activist who's a Methodist deacon, a trans woman. And she says that spectrum is a sex, and that means that lesbians and gays just can't exist. I'm just gobsmacked by the fact that she could say that and not think it was an issue. And then the people who made this film about pride would put it in, and it would survive all the edits, and it would be there. And basically, she was saying, we're old-fashioned and our identity or our attraction is just meaningless.
There's one question here which is about a little something that happened today on Twitter, which was that Boys magazine and David, who publishes Boys, was very clear about why he had retweeted the notice of this session. And he said, I did it because our readership is gay men, and I want gay men to be able to have access to, the range of views, and it's important that we have the kind of free speech. And the question says, the work LGB Alliance is doing is crucial, yet tonight there's been a campaign by members of the LGBT community to boycott Boys magazine purely for retweeting your event. Now the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, amongst others, have said they'll not display a copy of Boys magazine. How do we tackle cancel culture and bring other LGBT people on board? James, I mean, you've been buried in this for so long. Have you got ideas about how might we stop this, stop the cancel culture and start the debate and start an engagement?
Yeah, I think it is a very difficult one, and it's not going to happen overnight. I think it's, I can't remember which of us was talking about, even if we have to speak to gay men one at a time and convince them and wake them up to this, that's how we'll have to do it. I think there's I'm really pleased to have found LGBT Alliance, because it shows there are a group of people who are pulling people together and sharing that message. It's finding a JK Rowling of gay men to kind of be out there and not JK has not been cancelled as much as everyone would have liked to, but that's not to say that everyone else isn't at risk of that. I'm in a fortunate position. I'm self-employed. You're not going to be able to write to my boss and get me fired for my views. But it's more, what's most concerning, particularly with Twitter, particularly with seeing what's happened with Boys magazine on Twitter today, and the kind of repeat offenders of this kind of thing, is it's a hate group. I'm not even going to engage with that. And it's that shutting down of any kind of debate. It's being written off as it's just transphobic. If you don't agree 100%, it's transphobic. And it's having to have those conversations with people on a one-on-one basis. We're not going to be able to do that on social media, because social media, by its very design, is throwing rocks from behind a safe wall. So it's having those conversations and moving the needle slowly, for people to see how important this is.
So Lachlan, you're a political being to your bod. As you said, solidarity is your business. Have you got some practical tips for the way in which people might go about this kind of transformation that we need to make again?
I think it's the same as we've always had to do, which is about building grassroots links, and sometimes those are small. That might be one-to-one conversations. It might be small groups like this, where I think we have to face the fact that the institutional capture is there. So if the Vauxhall Tavern wants to, not stock Boys magazine, Boys will find another outlet. I applaud the Boys' decision for open debate. I don't understand how anyone in publishing can be similarly into the idea of censorship. Discussions like this, constant reiteration, organisation and solidarity with other groups. This has grown enormously since 2016, maybe since 2017. And there are a lot more people now, who are concerned about this. That still doesn't make it a majority of the influential decision makers. And we all have to keep, those of us who have access to that, have to keep making those arguments to reach a resolution. I don't want to see a winner or a loser. I don't want people to end this discussion with trans people not having adequate rights, not being protected, not having, that would be a loss for all of us. So it's up to us to put forward compromises and to keep being open to discussions.
Somebody's asked me about, particularly it says, how do you navigate, Simon, working within diversity and inclusion of the current climate? And it's really about this. It's one of the things that I say two things to people really fundamentally. One is that the point about diversity is precisely about the combination of difference. It's not a set of tram lines and a set of rigid groups. It's about understanding what people bring through who they are. And that's both their personality and their style, as well as their background and their origins, if you like. So firstly, that I say to people, diversity is about the combination of difference. And the second thing, the danger within the so-called inclusion agenda, is that it's become, in order to be inclusive, you have to speak like this, think like this, and behave like this. And if you don't, we'll exclude you. Now, that is not inclusion. What organisations need to be able to do is hold the ring on difficult conversations. And the other day I said this in something I was moderating, and the question came in, well, should we have room for racist voices, for instance? And I turned to a friend of mine who's black panelist, and I said, should we? And she said no. And I said, okay, who defines racism, for instance, in the context of an organisation? And we had a fascinating conversation about the difference between subjective, people's feelings and their real experience. And when I talk to my husband, who's black, about racism, I don't second guess his experience of racism, but neither he nor I would surrender the discussion to work out what to do about it to each other on the basis of our colour. So I always say that inclusion and diversity, they're all about difference. So that's the answer to that question. What about you mentioned, Lachlan, you mentioned institutional capture, if you like. All of you, let me ask you this question. Why do you think this has been, in a sense, are these senior leaders frightened of having a more reasonable discussion and have sort of caved to one particular view of what it's about to be LGBT? Lachlan first, and then James, and then Malcolm.
Okay, very quick 3-point answer. Press for Change was one of the most successful lobby groups of recent decades. It was
just explain to people what that was.
Sorry, Press for Change, which is Christine Burns, Stephen Whittle, were the people who really pushed the court cases that went to the European Court of Human Rights. I mean, they did more than this, but they pushed the court cases that went to the European Court of Human Rights and established what are transsexual rights, which have been broadened. So the first answer is Press for Change were a hugely successful lobby group. The second answer is that when Stonewall changed its view in 2000, where Stonewall changed its remit in 2015, an organisation with a huge underscored reputation, trust and resources was put at the disposal of a particular campaign and a particular type of campaign. And the answer to the question, why do people not speak out against it? I'm not going to name names. It's because some of them don't understand it and others don't care very much.
Certainly, one of the things I notice is that when I talk to organisations, and that happens to me the whole time, especially in the NHS, is that someone will try and complain that I'm, why they employ a transphobic person. If I have quiet, reasonable conversations, often actually I can have conversations with people who have complained. Actually, what's interesting is people are up for the discussion about how to resolve it in a really good way. James, what your history over the period, what do you think has been the contributing factors?
I think it's that this isn't happening in isolation. I think we are, and we could do a whole webinar on applied postmodernism and everything that comes with that in a woke world. Gender ideology and queer theory is just one part of that. But I think that's the context that it's sitting in, particularly in the workplace. There are other diversity group issues that it kind of relates to. So I think that's the workplace context. And as I think Lachlan said, there's a lot of people who just don't understand. I think politicians particularly don't want to be seen to say the wrong thing. So they don't actually understand, but they say what they think is the right thing on this. Trans rights are human rights. Trans rights are a great thing, but that doesn't mean a trans man, a male is literally a female. And like you say, there's a clash somewhere, and we have to have the conversation about how we work that out. It's a much more nuanced thing than a mantra or a slogan. But because they don't really understand it, They're just going along what they think is the right thing because they don't want to be accused of being transphobic, which is a word that's lost all meaning.
And it's interesting too, the very distinguished black historian in America, Adolph Reed, who's at a great age these days, wrote a piece once that was called, it was Dolezal bad, Jenner good. And what he was pointing out was that it appears the same people who think that Rachel Dolezal was not entitled to say, I'm black, are the same people who are saying, Caitlyn Jenner, hurrah, well done, marvellous. And actually, his point was that what does that mean? What is the basis on which we make these judgments? We're getting very near the end now, but Malcolm, if there's one thing that you would urge people to do as a result of listening to these discussions and so on, what's your ask to gay men?
Oh, that's a big one. I mean, I'd say above all, I mean, just be open-minded. I mean, the one thing surely about being gay is that we're not supposed to be the conforming sort of closed minds. It was only because we were willing to challenge what we were told was normal when we were kids that we are who we are. And so I would say, you know, channel your inner gay and you know, question authority and find out stuff. I mean, I think it's really important that we don't impute the worst motives to people. So I try really hard, you know, because we get involved obviously in big Twitter arguments, and you know, you can think that's the enemy and we're their enemy, and it's a really bad place to get drifted into. I like to, on the capture thing, I would say that a lot of institutions and people buy into this stuff because people really want to be nice. They want an opportunity. You know, if you run a school or you run a health board or whatever, and Stonewall comes in and gives you all this training, you think, oh my God, I've got a chance to make a difference and be nice and kind to people. And so they're not trying to be bigoted or anti-gay or whatever, but they're buying into this stuff, which has, unfortunately, dangerous stuff embedded in it.
Lachlan, your ask of gay men? You're still muted, my love.
Be honest, remember, and particularly remember what it was like growing up to be gay yourself, and what it is like to be a gender non-conforming person, and how distressing and confusing that can be, because it was for most of us. Bear that in mind and engage honestly.
And James, last thought, and then perhaps, I understand somebody said that there's some kind of men's group meeting afterwards, which I think you can describe to people what it is. So perhaps you would say your ask to gay men and then tell them where they can go to town.
My ask would be to any gay men or anyone watching this, but particularly gay men, speak to your gay male friends about this. You don't have to have a long, involved debate. You haven't got to kind of disprove or prove every single point. You can pick out a couple of things that there are common myths that you can kind of correct them on. I know there's a big piece that people talk about for straight men. It's about sport and transgender women in sport, and it's the first time they've thought about that. I think it's just finding those little things to talk to your friends about. I mean, for me particularly, it's the puberty blockers and transitioning, or you know, potentially gay kids ending up going down a trans route without kind of question, is an area I kind of try and bring up because it's an area people haven't thought about and they can relate to. So I think don't be afraid of having the conversations with people.
Okay. And this after party?
Yeah, so there's a group of gay and bisexual men on Twitter who got in touch. They do book clubs and various things like that. They're opening their Zoom room once we're finished on this webinar. So we're going to put the link to that. I think we put the link to that in the chat. So any gay and bisexual men that want to kind of go into a Zoom chat and speak to and see other participants about the issues we've been talking about, or about the challenges you've had in being kind of gender critical in the world, there'll be that session following this one.
Great, thank you. And Malcolm, just on behalf of LGB Alliance, perhaps you could tell people, you know, what's the plan for next year and how they can help.
Oh, I didn't know I was going to get asked that question.
You were told.
Well, we're going to, we're putting in a number of legal documents and challenges to institutions like the EHRC. We've been, believe it or not, we were on a Zoom call with the United Nations Committee We've been talking to MPs, MSPs. I mean, behind the scenes, we talk to a lot of important people for some hate group. I mean, if these people thought we were a hate group, they wouldn't be talking to us. And so we've got a lot of bold plans. Go to the website and look at all our stuff.
So is the theme of this, from what I understand what you're saying, is the theme of that, that what you're trying to do is open up the discussion that we've all been saying is really, really needed? I mean, in a sense, is that the central kind of theme of what you're
you
trying
can see
to
the
do?
difference between last year and this year. It's a completely transformed situation. We're so much more coverage. I mean, the fact that boys placed that tweet is surprising enough, but look how paranoid the reaction was. That shows you that the other side is really worried. And
but in a positive sense, what you're saying is that, I mean, I'm just trying to get a kind of positive last moment, which is that what we're really trying to aim for, presumably here, is an opening up of this discussion, not a series of attacks by anybody. And the LGB Alliance is, I mean, it certainly has been said to me that one of the things that you must, you know, what's important is that you keep it positive, and people have said that a lot to me.
yeah, well, I mean, you only have to follow our Twitter account to see that we try to be as positive as possible. We're open to discussion. We've never said no to anybody discussing with anyone. And I think it's just incremental change, bit by bit, by being respectful of other people and being positive. You convince them by your attitude.
And can people get involved?
I've been told by our lesbian overlords who run LGB Alliance that I've been given my marching orders here. I'm supposed to tell people to donate, and I'm supposed to read out the website address. Can I do that?
I guess so. It's your webinar.
Donate.lgballiance.org.uk. That's where to donate. Right, I've done what I was supposed to do.
Well done. You've done your thing. Lachlan, James, Malcolm, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
I've certainly learned something, and I feel I think about this far too much. So thank you very much. And I thank you to everybody for watching and listening. And thank you very much for the questions. They were very heartfelt.